So now bringing it out into the sort of this real world scenario, like, as people are if they're watching this video, or maybe they watch the first few minutes and they're skipping ahead to this part, and that's, people watch these videos in different ways. So as someone who's sort of skeptical about the program, if it's a good fit for them, and sort of, how do you walk them through it? How do you sort of lay it out to say, no, this is a good program, or this isn't a good program for you?
Well, what we've done is we've boiled this down, not just to margin drop, because, it is important for people to understand the margin for AgriStability, because it is a margin-based program. But we find that even when we explain margins to people, it's hard for them to relate to a 30% margin drop. That rule of 7.5, that's a step in the right direction in terms of getting them to relate to a 30% margin drop, and perhaps how little would be required to trigger that. But where we really bring it home is we've also done a similar graph, and we've focused just on the revenue drop. Because a lot of times producers get confused between margin drop and revenue drop. They think that is the same thing. And it's not. That, if they require a 30% margin drop to trigger, which every producer now does under the new rules, the revenue drop is quite different for different kinds of farms and different producers. So that same scale that we had on the bottom of that rule of 7.5 graph, I now have on a graph that is called revenue drop required to trigger AgriStability, because the revenue drop required to trigger is dependent on the cost structure that's in that margin. So the margins, again, are made up of allowable revenue minus allowable expense. The allowable expense is the direct costs of production. So anything related to capital, the interest, rent, repairs, those things are non-allowable. They're not included in the margin.
I see.
Direct costs of production are. So seed, fertilizer, and chemical for a crop farm, for example, salaries for everybody. For livestock, it would be feed and livestock purchases. So direct costs are in the margin. Now, the cost structure is, how do those costs relate to the revenue? So we have this eligible expense to eligible revenue ratio, and that's what we have on the bottom of both of these graphs plotted. It goes from 0.1 up to 1. And the farms that have a higher amount of those allowable costs relative to their revenue are on the right-hand side of the graph. They're Group 1 farms. The ones that are moderate are in the middle, they're Group 2. And the ones that have really low costs compared to their allowable revenue are on the far left, and they are Group 3. And the revenue drop required to trigger AgriStability is quite different for these different groups and different types of farms. The ones on the right-hand side, the program is much more responsive. And you can see on this kind of blue graph that, the farms on the right-hand side, the Group 1, the intensive livestock, for example, require only a single-digit drop in revenue. So, a 1.5%, a 4%, a 6% drop to trigger AgriStability. Whereas some of the farms in Group 2, dairy, beef, cow, calf, crop, they might require something in the low double digits. 12.5 to 14% or something like that.
Right.
So it's important for farms to understand where they are in here, because I think revenue drop is quite relevant to them. Most disasters from, whether it's a disaster on the farm period, or whether we're working out a disaster, whether it's a disaster for AgriStability, it's going to include a revenue drop component. So there's going to be something that affects production or price, or a combination of the two, which is going to make the revenue drop. And what we've found is that people have confused this with the margin drop, and they're very surprised when they can see how low of a revenue drop will trigger AgriStability for them.
Yeah, because I would imagine that there would be some confusion about that, because if you don't realize that so even because you could. So, okay. And just to kind of clarify that point, if you technically you could not have a revenue drop and you could have an increase but your production cost goes up to a point, eliminating certain things that you already said weren't in there. Could that trigger it as well, or does it have to be multi-component? Does it have to be a margin? Does it have to be a revenue drop and a cost? Can it be, how does that work?
Well, as I say, most disasters include some kind of revenue drop effect. They may or may not include an expense increase. Okay, if they have a revenue drop and at the same time have an expense increase, well, that helps to create the multiplier effect, if you will, in that rule of 7.5 that makes them more likely that they'll get some benefits. But, often there's little or no impact on the expenses, but there could be a massive impact on the revenue going down. So, sometimes the expense increase factors into it, and other times it doesn't.
So but most commonly it's about, you don't want to confuse your revenue drop with the margin, but it's generally mostly related to the revenue drop, essentially.
Yeah, you don't want to confuse the two. And I think it's very important for farmers to recognize that the revenue drop is probably less than they think. Because they might have been thinking that they needed to have a 30% revenue drop, but they'd be surprised that, maybe they need less than half of that in order to trigger benefits under agri-stability. The other thing that same graph shows is it has kind of the orange line branching off and heading up to the left there. That's the way it looked under reference margin limiting. So you can see that for farms that were kind of in that moderate cost structure, the group 2, or the very low cost structure, the group 3, that they were significantly impacted by the reference margin limiting. They required a higher revenue drop before than they're going to require now. And so that really brings home the value of the program now that reference margin limiting has been removed.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.